When Barrett opened her constitutional law textbook and pointed to a specific amendment, AOC's confident expression vanished. What constitutional principle was about to destroy AOC's entire progressive argument? Barrett's next words would shock the legal world. Georgetown University Law Center's magnificent Hart Auditorium had an electrically charged atmosphere this cold November evening. Constitutional law in modern America, a debate between perspectives, had been billed as the academic event of the year, bringing together one of the Supreme Court's most conservative justices with one of Congress's most progressive voices. The auditorium was packed to capacity with 800 attendees: law students, professors, legal scholars, journalists, and political observers who had traveled from across the country to witness this unprecedented intellectual confrontation. C-SPAN cameras captured multiple angles, while major news networks provided live coverage. The hashtag Barrett vs. OC had been trending for hours before the event even began. 52-year-old Supreme Court Justice Amy Vivian Coney Barrett represented the pinnacle of conservative legal scholarship in America. Born in New Orleans, Louisiana, she had grown up in a devoutly Catholic family that instilled in her both intellectual rigor and unwavering moral convictions. Her father, Michael Coney, was a Shell Oil Company lawyer, while her mother, Linda, was a high school French teacher who later became a homemaker to raise their 7 children. Barrett's academic journey had been nothing short of extraordinary. After graduating summa cum laude from Rhodes College with a Bachelor of Arts in English Literature, she had attended Notre Dame Law School, where she graduated first in her class and served as executive editor of the Notre Dame Law Review. Her professors described her as possessing one of the most brilliant legal minds they had ever encountered. Following law school, Barrett had clerked for Judge Lawrence Silberman on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, then for Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, who became her mentor and intellectual inspiration. Scalia's originalist philosophy, interpreting the Constitution according to its original public meaning, became the foundation of Barrett's judicial philosophy. After her clerkships, Barrett had worked briefly at the prestigious law firm Miller, Cassidy, LaRocca, and Lewin before accepting a position as a professor at Notre Dame Law School in 2002. For 15 years, she had taught constitutional law, federal courts, and statutory interpretation while building a reputation as one of the nation's foremost experts on originalist constitutional interpretation. Barrett's scholarship was both prolific and influential. She had published dozens of law review articles on topics ranging from statutory interpretation to the role of Catholic judges in death penalty cases. Her work was cited by courts across the country and studied in law schools nationwide. She had also co-authored a constitutional law casebook that was used in over 50 law schools. In 2017, President Trump had nominated Barrett to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 7th Circuit, where she had served with distinction for 3 years before being nominated to the Supreme Court following Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death in 2020. Her confirmation hearings had been contentious, with Democratic senators questioning her views on abortion, health care, and religious liberty, but she had been confirmed by a 52-48 vote along party lines. As a Supreme Court justice, Barrett had quickly established herself as a formidable legal mind and a reliable conservative vote. Her opinions were characterized by their intellectual rigor, clear writing, and unwavering commitment to originalist principles. Liberal critics accused her of judicial activism in service of conservative causes, while conservative supporters praised her for restraining judicial overreach and returning constitutional interpretation to its original foundations. Physically, Barrett was an imposing figure despite her modest 5 feet 7 inches stature. Her auburn hair was styled in a professional bob, and she wore minimal makeup that highlighted her sharp, intelligent features. Tonight, she wore a navy blue blazer over a crisp white blouse, with a simple strand of pearls, a look that conveyed both authority and accessibility. Her posture was perfect, her hands folded calmly, and her eyes radiated the confidence of someone who had never lost a constitutional argument. Across the stage sat 34-year-old Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, known universally as AOC, who represented everything Barrett opposed in modern American politics. Born in the Bronx to working-class Puerto Rican parents, AOC had grown up witnessing the struggles of immigrant families and low-income communities, experiences that had shaped her progressive worldview from an early age. AOC's path to prominence had been unconventional for a politician. After graduating cum laude from Boston University with degrees in international relations and economics, she had returned to the Bronx to help her mother fight foreclosure on their family home. She had worked as a bartender and waitress while organizing in her community, experiences that had given her a deep understanding of economic inequality and social justice issues. Her political awakening had come during the 2016 presidential campaign when she had volunteered for Bernie Sanders, learning about grassroots organizing and progressive politics. In 2018, she had launched a long-shot primary campaign against powerful Democratic incumbent Joe Crowley, running on a platform of Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, and economic justice. Her shocking victory had made her the youngest woman ever elected to Congress. Since arriving in Washington, AOC had become the most recognizable face of the progressive movement. Her social media presence was unprecedented for a politician, with millions of followers across platforms who hung on her every word. She had used her platform to advocate for ambitious progressive policies while calling out what she saw as systemic injustices in American society. AOC's approach to politics was combative and uncompromising. She saw herself as representing people who had been ignored by the political establishment, and she was willing to challenge anyone, including members of her own party, who she believed stood in the way of progress. Her supporters admired her authenticity and courage, while her critics accused her of being naive and radical. Tonight, AOC wore a sharp burgundy blazer over a black top, her dark hair flowing in loose waves past her shoulders. Her makeup was more dramatic than Barrett's, with bold lipstick and expertly contoured features that reflected her social media savvy. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never backed down from a fight, her chin raised defiantly and her eyes sparkling with the intensity that had made her famous. The contrast between the two women could not have been more stark. Barrett represented tradition, precedent, and constitutional constraint, while AOC embodied change, progress, and the belief that the Constitution must evolve to meet modern challenges. Their debate would crystallize the fundamental tension in American legal and political thought between originalism and living constitutionalism. The moderator for this historic encounter was Professor Erwin Chemerinsky, Dean of UC Berkeley School of Law and one of America's most respected constitutional scholars. Chemerinsky had written extensively about both conservative and liberal constitutional interpretation, making him uniquely qualified to facilitate a fair discussion between such ideologically opposed figures. Good evening, and welcome to what promises to be a fascinating exploration of constitutional interpretation in modern America. Chemerinsky began, his voice carrying the authority of 4 decades in legal academia. Tonight we have the rare opportunity to hear directly from Justice Amy Coney Barrett of the Supreme Court and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez about their very different visions for how the Constitution should guide our democracy. The audience settled into respectful silence as Chemerinsky outlined the format. Each participant would make a brief opening statement, followed by structured discussion on specific constitutional topics, and concluding with audience questions. The topics would include the Commerce Clause, the 14th Amendment, and the role of the federal government in addressing modern challenges. Justice Barrett, Chemerinsky said, turning to the Supreme Court Justice, would you begin by explaining your originalist approach to constitutional interpretation and how it guides your judicial philosophy? Barrett nodded graciously and leaned toward her microphone. When she spoke, her voice carried the measured authority of someone who had spent decades studying the Constitution's finest details. Thank you, Dean Chemerinsky. Originalism is simply the idea that we should interpret the Constitution according to its original public meaning, that is, what the text meant to ordinary readers at the time it was adopted. This isn't about imposing my personal preferences or political views. It's about recognizing that the Constitution's meaning doesn't change simply because society changes. She paused, looking directly at the audience. The Constitution contains mechanisms for change, the amendment process, but judges don't have the authority to rewrite the Constitution based on their view of what would be good policy. That would make us legislators, not judges, and it would undermine the democratic process by which the people, through their elected representatives, decide how to govern themselves. Barrett's opening was textbook originalism, delivered with the clarity and conviction that had made her one of its most effective advocates. The conservative members of the audience nodded approvingly, while liberal listeners looked skeptical. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, Kimerinsky said, "How do you view the Constitution's role in addressing modern challenges, particularly those the founders could never have anticipated?" AOC leaned forward with the energy and passion that had made her a social media phenomenon. Her response was immediate and forceful. "With respect, Justice Barrett, I fundamentally disagree with this idea that we should be bound by the intentions of men who lived in a completely different world. The founders owned enslaved people. Women couldn't vote. Indigenous peoples were being genocided. LGBTQ+ people were criminalized. Working people had no rights." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "The Constitution is supposed to be a living document that grows with our understanding of justice and equality. When Justice Barrett talks about original public meaning, she's talking about a public that excluded most Americans from participation in democracy. Why should their narrow understanding limit our ability to create a more perfect union?" The audience stirred at AOC's direct challenge. This wasn't going to be a polite academic discussion. This was going to be a battle over the fundamental nature of American constitutional democracy. Barrett maintained her composure, but observers could see a slight tightening around her eyes. She had faced this argument countless times, but rarely in such a direct, public confrontation. "Congresswoman," Barrett replied calmly, "with respect, you're conflating the Constitution's meaning with its application. Yes, the Constitution was written by imperfect men in an imperfect time. But its principles, equal protection, due process, freedom of speech, are timeless. The fact that these principles were imperfectly applied doesn't mean the principles themselves are flawed." She opened a leather-bound copy of the Constitution that she had brought with her. "Take the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Its original meaning guaranteed equal treatment under law. The fact that this principle was initially applied only to certain groups doesn't change its meaning. It means previous generations failed to fully implement the Constitution's commands." "But that's exactly my point," AOC interjected, her voice rising with passion. "Your original meaning approach has been used to justify centuries of oppression. Separate but equal was supposedly constitutional under your originalism. Excluding women from professions was constitutional. Criminalizing homosexuality was constitutional. For more information about this incredible constitutional showdown, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Because Barrett's response to AOC's challenge is about to completely change the direction of this debate. Barrett's expression remained serene, but those who knew her well could detect the subtle signs that she was about to deliver a devastating response. She carefully turned several pages in her constitutional law textbook until she found what she was looking for. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez," Barrett said, her voice taking on the tone she used when correcting first-year law students, "I appreciate your passion, but I'm afraid your understanding of originalism is fundamentally flawed. Let me show you something." She held up her textbook, pointing to a specific amendment. "You mentioned that originalism supposedly supported separate but equal. But that's historically inaccurate. The original public meaning of the 14th Amendment, passed in 1868, was understood by its framers and ratifiers to prohibit racial segregation." AOC's confident expression began to waver as Barrett continued with surgical precision. "In 1875, just 7 years after the 14th Amendment was ratified, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which prohibited racial segregation in public accommodations. This was done by the same generation that had ratified the amendment. The Supreme Court's decision in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 wasn't originalist. It was a betrayal of originalism." Barrett flipped to another page. "Similarly, when you claim that excluding women from professions was constitutional under originalism, you're ignoring the original meaning of the 14th Amendment's Privileges or Immunities Clause, which many founders understood to include economic liberty, the right to pursue any lawful occupation." The audience was riveted as Barrett systematically dismantled AOC's understanding of constitutional history. Legal scholars in the audience were taking furious notes, recognizing they were witnessing a masterclass in constitutional interpretation. "The problem, Congresswoman, isn't originalism," Barrett continued. "The problem is that for much of our history, judges abandoned originalism in favor of their own policy preferences, just as you're advocating now. Plessy v. Ferguson, Lochner v. New York, Korematsu v. United States. These weren't originalist decisions. They were examples of judges substituting their own judgment for the Constitution's text." AOC was clearly struggling to respond. Her usual quick wit seemed to have deserted her as she faced an intellectual opponent unlike any she had encountered in Congress. "But Justice Barrett," AOC said, trying to regain her footing, What about women's rights? The Constitution doesn't explicitly mention gender equality. Under your originalism, how can we protect women's reproductive rights or ensure equal pay? Barrett's eyes lit up with what could only be described as professorial delight. This was exactly the opening she had been waiting for. That's an excellent question, Congresswoman, and it perfectly illustrates the difference between constitutional interpretation and policy making. The Constitution doesn't explicitly mention many things: automobiles, the internet, corporations. But it provides principles that apply to new situations. She turned to yet another section of her textbook. The 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause prohibits the government from denying any person equal protection of the laws. The original public meaning of person included women. The question isn't whether women have constitutional rights. They clearly do. The question is how to apply constitutional principles to specific situations. Barrett leaned forward, her voice taking on a more serious tone. But here's where you and I fundamentally disagree, Congresswoman. You want judges to decide policy questions based on their view of what's just or fair. I believe judges should interpret the law and leave policy making to elected officials like you. Take abortion, Barrett continued, causing a visible stir in the audience. Roe v. Wade didn't just interpret the Constitution. It created a detailed regulatory framework for abortion policy. That's not judging, that's legislating. Whether abortion should be legal and under what circumstances are important questions, but they're questions for voters and their elected representatives, not unelected judges. AOC attempted to interrupt, but Barrett held up her hand. Let me finish, Congresswoman. If you believe women have a constitutional right to abortion, then convince your fellow legislators to pass a constitutional amendment. That's how our democracy is supposed to work. You don't get to bypass the democratic process just because you think your policy preferences are more enlightened than the founders. The audience was completely silent. Even AOC's supporters were beginning to recognize that she was being outclassed by Barrett's superior knowledge of constitutional law and history. But Justice Barrett, AOC said, her voice now noticeably less confident, that's incredibly naive. We can't get constitutional amendments passed in this political climate. The system is rigged against progress. Sometimes the court has to step in to protect people's rights when the political process fails. Barrett shook her head with what appeared to be genuine sadness. Congresswoman, what you're describing isn't constitutional interpretation, it's judicial supremacy. You're saying that when the democratic process doesn't produce the results you want, unelected judges should impose them anyway. She opened her textbook to the preamble of the Constitution. Our Constitution begins with "we the people," not "we the judges." The legitimacy of our entire system depends on the consent of the governed. When judges start making policy decisions based on their personal views of justice rather than the law, they undermine that legitimacy. Moreover, Barrett continued, your approach is incredibly dangerous to the very causes you claim to support. Today you might have liberal judges who agree with your policy preferences. But what happens when you have conservative judges? If you establish the principle that judges can ignore constitutional text in favor of their own sense of justice, you can't complain when conservative judges do the same thing. AOC was now visibly struggling. Her usual rhetorical tools, appeals to emotion, moral outrage, and progressive talking points, were useless against Barrett's systematic legal analysis. I think you're mischaracterizing my position, AOC said weakly. I'm not advocating for judicial activism. I'm saying the Constitution should be interpreted in light of our evolving understanding of equality and justice. Barrett's response was swift and devastating. Congresswoman, with all due respect, that's exactly what judicial activism is. You're asking judges to update the Constitution based on their, or your, evolving understanding of justice. But whose understanding? Yours? Mine? A majority of voters? A majority of legal scholars? She closed her textbook with a definitive snap. The genius of originalism is that it provides an objective standard for constitutional interpretation. The original public meaning doesn't change based on the political winds or the personal preferences of whoever happens to be wearing a judicial robe. Professor Chemerinsky, sensing that AOC was in serious trouble, tried to throw her a lifeline. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, how would you respond to Justice Barrett's argument about democratic legitimacy? AOC took a deep breath, clearly trying to regroup. Justice Barrett talks about democratic legitimacy, But what about the legitimacy of a system that allows a minority to block progress indefinitely? What about the legitimacy of a constitution that gives more power to land than to people? It was a desperate pivot to electoral politics, but Barrett was ready for it. Congresswoman, you're conflating constitutional interpretation with political outcomes. Yes, our Constitution includes counter-majoritarian features, the Senate, the Electoral College, the amendment process. But those features were intentionally designed to prevent temporary majorities from trampling minority rights. Barrett's voice took on a more pointed tone. You complain about minority rule, but what you're really advocating is rule by judicial minority. You want 5 unelected judges to impose policies that you can't get through the democratic process. How is that more legitimate than requiring broad consensus for constitutional change? The intellectual mismatch was becoming painful to watch. AOC, for all her political skills and progressive passion, was simply outgunned in a constitutional law debate against one of the Supreme Court's most brilliant minds. Dean Chemerinsky tried once more to help AOC. Let's turn to a specific issue. Congresswoman, how would you apply constitutional principles to climate change, which the founders obviously couldn't have anticipated? AOC seized on the question eagerly. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Climate change is an existential threat that requires immediate federal action. Under Justice Barrett's originalism, the federal government apparently has no power to address the greatest challenge of our time because the founders didn't write climate change into the Constitution. She was gaining confidence again, back on familiar political ground. We need a Green New Deal, massive federal investment in renewable energy, and regulations on carbon emissions. But Justice Barrett's Supreme Court keeps striking down environmental regulations because they weren't specifically enumerated in 1787. Barrett waited patiently for AOC to finish, then delivered what would be the final blow of the evening. Congresswoman, once again you're demonstrating a fundamental misunderstanding of constitutional law. The federal government absolutely has power to address climate change through the Commerce Clause, the Spending Clause, and other enumerated powers. The question isn't whether the federal government can act, but whether it can act in ways that exceed constitutional limits. Barrett opened her textbook to Article 1, Section 8. The Constitution grants Congress broad powers to regulate interstate commerce, provide for the common defense, and promote the general welfare. A properly designed climate change program could easily fit within these powers. The problem, Barrett continued, isn't that the Constitution prevents climate action. The problem is that you want to bypass constitutional processes. You want administrative agencies to make rules without proper congressional authorization. You want federal bureaucrats to regulate local land use that has traditionally been a state responsibility. You want to ignore property rights protected by the Fifth Amendment. Barrett's voice grew more forceful. If climate change is really the existential threat you claim, then convince your fellow Americans to support the policies you want. Pass laws through Congress. Work with states. Amend the Constitution if necessary. But don't ask judges to ignore constitutional limits just because you think your cause is urgent. AOC made one final attempt. But Justice Barrett, by the time we go through all those processes, it might be too late. Sometimes the Constitution has to bend to reality. Barrett's response was quiet but devastating. Congresswoman, every generation faces challenges that seem too urgent for constitutional processes. Slavery was urgent. The Civil War was urgent. The Great Depression was urgent. World War II was urgent. The Cold War was urgent. She paused, looking directly at AOC. But the moment we decide that our current crisis justifies abandoning constitutional limits, we've lost what makes America special. The Constitution isn't a suggestion to be followed only when it's convenient. It's the supreme law of the land, and it binds all of us, including you, including me. The auditorium fell into complete silence. Even AOC's most ardent supporters could see that she had been intellectually eviscerated. Her political passion and good intentions were no match for Barrett's superior knowledge, logical precision, and decades of constitutional scholarship. Dean Chemerinsky, recognizing that the debate was effectively over, began to wrap up. I think we have time for just one audience question. Yes, the young woman in the third row. A law student stood up nervously. Justice Barrett, given everything we've heard tonight, what advice would you give to young people who want to make progressive change in America? Barrett smiled warmly, her stern professorial demeanor softening. That's a wonderful question. First, I'd say that wanting to make the world better is admirable, regardless of your political views. The question is how to do it effectively and legitimately. She gestured toward AOC. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez and I disagree about many things, but I deeply respect her commitment to her constituents and her willingness to fight for what she believes in. That's exactly what our democracy needs, passionate advocates who care about making life better for all Americans. But, Barrett continued, if you want to create lasting change, you need to do it the right way. Learn the Constitution. Understand how our system works. Build coalitions. Convince your fellow citizens. Win elections. Pass laws. That's how real, sustainable progress happens. Barrett looked directly at AOC, her expression sympathetic but firm. Taking shortcuts through the courts might seem faster, but it ultimately backfires. Court decisions without Democratic support are fragile and divisive. Real change comes from changing hearts and minds, not from judicial decrees. As the event concluded, the contrast couldn't have been more stark. Barrett had demonstrated the intellectual power of conservative constitutional thought, while AOC had shown the limitations of progressive politics when confronted with serious legal analysis. The aftermath was swift and overwhelming. Within hours, video clips of Barrett's systematic dismantling of AOC's arguments were viral across social media. #BarrettSchoolsAOC trended worldwide, with legal scholars from across the political spectrum praising Barrett's performance. Even liberal commentators were forced to acknowledge Barrett's intellectual dominance. Harvard law professor Lawrence Tribe, usually a harsh critic of conservative judges, tweeted, "Whatever you think of her judicial philosophy, Coney Barrett just gave a masterclass in constitutional law." AOC came to a gunfight with a butter knife. The New York Times, despite its editorial opposition to Barrett's judicial philosophy, ran a headline, "Supreme Court Justice Demonstrates Intellectual Firepower in Debate with Progressive Congresswoman." The article noted that Barrett had systematically addressed every constitutional argument with precision and depth that highlighted the difference between political advocacy and legal scholarship. Fox News, predictably, was even more enthusiastic. Tucker Carlson devoted an entire segment to what he called the moment a Supreme Court justice reminded America what expertise actually looks like. Conservative legal scholars used the debate as evidence that originalism wasn't just politically convenient, but intellectually superior to living constitutionalism. AOC's response on social media was notably subdued. Rather than her usual fiery tweets, she posted a simple message, "Had a challenging but educational evening discussing constitutional law at Georgetown. Grateful for the opportunity to engage with different perspectives. The fight for justice continues." Behind the scenes, AOC's staff was reportedly furious that she had agreed to the debate without adequate preparation. Several progressive organizations that had supported the event quietly criticized AOC's performance, with one activist telling Politico, "She walked into an ambush." You don't debate constitutional law with a Supreme Court justice unless you're equally prepared. The long-term implications of the debate extended far beyond one evening's entertainment. Barrett had demonstrated that conservative constitutional thought wasn't just politically motivated, but intellectually rigorous. Her ability to cite specific constitutional text, historical context, and legal precedent while dismantling progressive arguments showed why conservative legal scholars had gained such influence in recent decades. For AOC, the debate was a humbling reminder that political passion and social media savvy weren't sufficient for every arena. Constitutional law required deep study, historical knowledge, and intellectual precision that couldn't be substituted with moral outrage or progressive talking points. Law schools across the country began incorporating clips from the debate into their constitutional law courses as examples of different approaches to constitutional interpretation. Students on both sides of the political spectrum found themselves grudgingly respecting Barrett's intellectual prowess, even when they disagreed with her conclusions. Perhaps most importantly, the debate illustrated why the Supreme Court commanded such respect and fear from both sides of the political spectrum. Barrett's performance showed that the court's power didn't just come from its institutional authority, but from the intellectual caliber of its members. When the nation's most brilliant legal minds engaged in constitutional interpretation, their conclusions carried weight that went beyond mere political preference. 6 months later, when Barrett authored the majority opinion in a major constitutional case, observers noted that her reasoning closely paralleled the arguments she had made against AOC. The debate hadn't just been an academic exercise. It had been a preview of how one of America's most influential judges approached the nation's most important legal questions. For constitutional scholars, The debate became a defining moment in the ongoing contest between originalist and living constitutional interpretation. Barrett had shown that originalism wasn't a cover for conservative politics, but a sophisticated methodology for understanding constitutional text. Whether one agreed with her conclusions or not, her intellectual rigor was undeniable. This incredible constitutional showdown demonstrates what happens when political passion meets legal expertise. Sometimes the most important lessons come from acknowledging when we're outmatched and using that knowledge to become better advocates for our beliefs. If you found this intellectual battle fascinating, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more incredible confrontations between America's sharpest minds. Comment below. Do you think AOC learned something valuable from this debate? Share this video with anyone who appreciates the importance of constitutional knowledge in American democracy. Because sometimes, expertise really does matter, and preparation beats passion every single time.